I thought, bonjour, I thought I'd have a little fun before this announcement. And given that this pandemic has had such a devastating effect on entrepreneurship, even more so in particular Indigenous entrepreneurship and Indigenous women that are doing some amazing work across Canada, I wanted to highlight the work done by a local Mohawk artist from Akwesasne called Tanya Kloot. This is it's a piece, as you saw me struggling to take it off. It's a piece of art first and foremost that is the result of a tremendous amount of intricate beadwork. Tanya has also created some masks that are now on exhibit now in Banff as part of a moving exhibit at the White Museum. The mask she created that is now on tour is called Breathe. This is a mask that's called Garunya Niro, which means precious sky, and is a contemporary example of Haudenosaunee flat beadwork. Along the top of the mask, and you can see the spiral designs that symbolize air currents in the crystal blue sky. It's influenced by, the mask was influenced obviously by the global pandemic and thinking about how COVID has impacted our airways, making the instinctual act of breathing very precious. The mask is designed with elements of Haudenosaunee iconography, including sky domes along the bottom edge, which represent the relationship between our world and the sky world where life came from. And these symbols are an integral part of Haudenosaunee traditional stories and traditional knowledge, in particular about medicines. The central image in the front is the artist's interpretation of the celestial tree, representing the importance of masks as a form of medicine during the pandemic. It's a symbol of hope and the importance of masks in medicine and bringing that hope to people, and in particular being the ability and capability to protect each other from an invisible virus. So before we get going on another serious topic, I did want to highlight the incredible work that's being done around this country by artists and creators as they continue to struggle through the pandemic and think of creative ways to reproduce their work. Kwe, good afternoon, bonjour, sego. Je tiens à souligner que
I'd like to emphasize that today we are on traditional territory of the Algonquin people.
the pandemic has been adept at causing social disruption, significantly impacting our everyday lives and all things that we once took for granted, things like hugging your parents, to celebrating special occasions and milestones with loved ones, or even going to work or visiting friends on a daily basis. Nothing's quite the same as it was this time last year. This has been no different and sometimes far worse for Indigenous peoples. They've also made a lot of sacrifices and taken action to protect their communities. If anything, COVID-19 has further magnified existing socioeconomic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And while the pandemic has not in any way changed our commitment to continue working with Indigenous peoples towards closing those gaps, it's posed new challenges and obstacles. It has caused delays in lifting long-term drinking water advisories in some First Nations communities. In some cases, because of COVID, many projects lost a full construction season. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. In other instances, some communities, in responding rightfully to the pandemic, decided to limit their entry into communities to protect the health and safety of their members. Consequently, construction crews could not enter, and in other cases, supplies were delayed. These are life-saving decisions that we have and we must continue to respect. But this hasn't been the only challenge that we've faced. From shorter and warmer winters and making access to communities by winter roads more unpredictable, to hiring and retaining qualified and priorities, as well as infrastructure delays that affect many other projects in Canada and far too often Indigenous communities. These are all factors that need to be taken into consideration when working towards ensuring access to clean, safe, and reliable water for First Nations on reserves. But one thing has not changed: the right for individuals to have access to potable water. And we are determined to ensure that this right is upheld for everyone, including all First Nations living on reserve. While most Canadians have access to clean and reliable drinking water, many First Nations communities still face pressing water issues. Imagine having to boil the water you're about to consume every time you reach for a glass of water. Imagine doing this every day of your life, multiple times per day for over 17 years. That was the reality of the community and the members of Lac Seul in Ontario before their new water plant was completed, inaugurated, and opened in February of this year. It is also the current condition and situation faced by the people of Neskantaga. In their case, for 25 years. L'accès à une eau potable sûre, propre et fiable pour tous les habitants de ce pays.
Access to safe, clean, reliable drinking water for all the inhabitants of this country is an absolute priority for the Government of Canada. Before we came to power in November 2015, there were 105 long-term drinking water advisories for public systems and 67 First Nations living in reserves. COVID-19 has further magnified existing socio-economic gaps, and while the pandemic has not changed the way our commitment to working with Indigenous peoples towards closing those gaps, it has posed new challenges and obstacles. It's caused delays in lifting long-term drinking water advisories in some First Nation communities. It's made, along with climate change, which means longer winters and shorter and hotter winters, it has made access to communities during winter roads more difficult. One thing has not changed, however, the right for people to have drinking water. We are determined that this right should be respected for all, including for First Nations living on reserves. Although most Canadians have access to clean, reliable drinking water, countless First Nation communities still face pressing water problems. Imagine having to boil your water each and every time you wanted to drink a glass or wanted to cook. Imagine doing this every single day of your life, several times a day for the last 17 years. That was the reality of members of the Lac Seul community. Is unacceptable.
However, recognizes that since 2016, we have done a lot. Since 2016, the Government of Canada has provided $2.19 billion to build and repair water and wastewater infrastructure, support the efficient management and maintenance of on-reserve water systems and strengthen capacity through better training of water systems operators. I know a lot of work remains, but the progress made cannot be erased. Since that historic investment, over 600 water and wastewater projects have been initiated in First Nations communities, 97 long-term drinking water advisories were lifted, and importantly, 171 long-term advisories were prevented. The long-term drinking water advisory commitment was made to drive forward actions to address drinking water issues and concerns on reserve. This approach has worked. Partnering with First Nations, we've collectively taken a number of important actions that have improved drinking water on reserve. But let's be clear, this is a process, not a single event. From detecting and identifying the cause of the problem to feasibility studies and design, construction and planning, lifting a drinking water advisory is a multifaceted process, a process that requires long-term and stable and reliable investments and dedication. This has been said to us loud and clear by our First Nations partners. And yet, as significant as this progress may be, much remains to be done. Our work on water infrastructure is not just focused on the short term. We want to build a sustainable system that ensures that First Nation communities have access to safe drinking water now and for generations to come. And today, we're making ourselves accountable. We're making future governments accountable. And while there have been many reasons for the delay, I want to state as clearly as possible that ultimately I bear the responsibility for this, and I have the responsibility and the duty to get this done. Today, we're announcing an additional investment of more than $1.5 billion to accelerate work to lift all long-term drinking water advisories on reserve. What communities want is not an Ottawa-imposed deadline. It's training and retention of qualified staff and support for the daily operations and maintenance activities, which is critical to ensuring the lasting effects of these investments. With this new funding, we're standing with First Nations partners to ensure access to clean and safe drinking water for generations to come. For every community with a long-term drinking water advisory, there is a project team and an action plan in place to resolve it. Providing First Nations communities with the resources they need to operate and maintain their water systems is central to creating long-lasting solutions. To detect and identify issues and problems with the water systems earlier and ensure long-term drinking water advisories are reduced going forward, we will be allocating $616 million over 6 years to First Nations on reserve. This new investment will offer reliable and lasting funding for First Nations so they can keep water infrastructures in their community in good condition, resulting in longer water system life cycles and more durable solutions. Building and improving clean water infrastructure is also a core component of any work to provide access to clean and reliable drinking water. Today's investment also includes an investment of $553 million in new funding to continue to build and support water and wastewater infrastructure on reserve to prevent future long-term drinking water advisories from occurring. Additionally, $309 million will be allocated to support the ongoing work to lift all long-term drinking water advisories on public systems on reserve by helping to respond to the project delays, including those due to COVID-19. Le financement annoncé de plus de 1,5 milliard de dollars soutiendra.
The funding of more than $1.5 billion will support First Nations to maintain some 1,200 water and waterwork networks and ensure the reliability of the service for years to come. This means that communities, without having to work towards a deadline, will have a long-term commitment for access to clean drinking water. They need funding to do so to support measures such as training, retaining qualified personnel, and support for their daily activities, operations, and cleaning, for example. Maintenance, which is essential to ensure that these investments have long-term effects. With this funding, we'll be working alongside our First Nation partners to ensure that access to clean drinking water is a given for generations to come. Providing First Nations community with the resources they need to run and maintain their water and waterworks systems, wastewater systems, is essential for long-lasting solutions. To support daily operations and maintenance of these infrastructures, and even after the lifting of water advisories, we will allocate $616.3 million over 6 years for First Nations living on reserves. This new investment will supply long-lasting and reliable funding that the First Nations can use to maintain their infrastructures in good condition. It will also help, this funding will also support training for operators and help communities to better retain qualified operators for years to come. The construction and improvement of drinking water infrastructure are also an essential part of the work to be done to provide clean, reliable drinking water. In this respect, today's investment also includes $553 million that will continue to fund these infrastructures in reserves so that they can avoid new drinking water advisories. Moreover, $309 million will be allocated to support efforts to lift all long-term drinking water advisories for public networks in reserves to help respond to delays.
Partnership. We're listening to communities, and we want to let them know that our government is going to be there for the long run. The work that's been done is guided by the urgency of the need, but it cannot be dictated by an imposed deadline. It is set according to First Nations priorities, and they may have a lot of priorities. For example, in Shoal Lake 40 First Nations, the critical Freedom Road was completed before work began on their water system. The road allowed them to be able to bring the necessary equipment into their community, and work continues today on their new water treatment plant. Every boiled water advisory is unique, and we are actively exploring every possible solution in coordination with community leadership to ensure safe, clean drinking water. Our decisions must respect and listen to community needs and respond to community priorities. This work is key, and we are working quickly with communities and partners to end all long-term drinking water advisories. That is what Canadians expect from us. More must be done, and today's announcement is a reminder of the urgency of that need. It's a reminder of our commitment to First Nations and to reconciliation. And let me be clear, safe and reliable drinking water. Notre objectif reste le même, construire et...
Our goal remains the same, to build and maintain sustainable systems that will provide First Nation communities with access to safe drinking water for the long term, forever. We will continue to work in partnership with First Nations leaders so that everyone in every community has access to clean, safe, reliable drinking water. These are shared goals and shared achievements that show that... We'll now take questions from the journalists. One question, one follow-up question.
Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Our first question is from Christy Kirkup from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Minister. Respectfully, you said today that First Nations don't want a self-imposed deadline, but it was in fact the Prime Minister himself who campaigned in 2015 to end long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations in 5 years. So how long has the government known that it would not make its own target of March 2021, and why not just be upfront about that fact sooner?
Thanks for the question, Kirsty. And this has to be put into perspective. This was an ambitious deadline from the get-go. When we say that it was an Ottawa imposed deadline, or it was a deadline we set, those communities weren't sounded to say what time was reasonable, nor was their planning done. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been working in communities to lift those diligently, as you've seen. But the reality is, when you engage with those communities, it's place. And so as we walk with them and engage with them and say, well, we've said we would like to lift this by March 2019 or spring 2019, we've been examining a whole suite of options with them. And sometimes those options aren't acceptable to the community. In most cases, we've been able to fulfill that deadline, and we've put a lot of pressure on our own teams to get that done because we know how important water is to communities. The reality is there are water advisories all around this country, but once again, they disproportionately affect Indigenous communities more than non-Indigenous communities. So communities rightfully have said to us, well, what's going to happen in spring 2019? Are you going to walk away from us? Are these long-term water advisories that get lifted going to suddenly go to short-term water advisories, and then a year later get put back up to long-term water advisories? And obviously, as I've experienced over the last year as a minister, one of the biggest barriers to moving forward in this relationship is one of trust. So that trust means it needs to be a two-way street in terms of dialogue. And what we've heard loud and clear from these communities is that they want to walk in partnership with us, particularly in one area that's been highlighted time and time again, and that's in the area of operations and maintenance of these state-of-the-art plants, in some cases when you're talking about new builds. And so I'm jumping around on answers to your question, Kirsty, because I know the questions that Canadians will have. But what we're saying to communities today is we're there for the long term. This isn't a deadline where we'll just walk away and somehow our consciences are clear. Quite the opposite. This is a much deeper commitment to walking along the path of ensuring that communities have safe access to clean and reliable drinking water for the long term. If you look at the challenges that we've faced, this is even before that we start talking about a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that has resulted in the loss, in some cases, of a construction season. So if you look at some of the cases that remain, some of the difficult ones, you come down to about 12 or more, or a few more communities, some of whom have seen serious delays due to COVID, and they're working hard to clear them, and others that have priorities they want addressed before they lift their water advisories. And Ottawa doesn't lift those water advisories, the communities do. So our commitment today is to work with them and their infrastructure needs to ensure that they have clean, reliable drinking water. And you asked how long have we known? We've known for a long time there have been challenges. We've been scrambling to meet those deadlines despite what I said was, and everyone knows is a historic pandemic. But we've also been scrambling to deploy all resources to help communities lift those deadlines by spring 2019. And what I believe is important in all this is to be as clear as possible to Canadians and to Indigenous communities as to what that commitment is and how we will help them lift those water advisories that no community should have.
Chris, did you have a follow-up?
And just as a follow-up, yes, thank you. Minister, I hear you saying today that you bear responsibility for this as the Indigenous Services Minister, but I'm wondering, was it appropriate for the Prime Minister to impose or suggest a timeline in the 2015 campaign? And what about the Prime Minister's responsibility in this? What responsibility does the Prime Minister bear in this?
Well, two things. As a Canadian, the Prime Minister did what would be expected of any leadership and said, we want to get this done. I think quickly in this, the spring 2019 deadline has become sort of a rallying cry for something that is much more profound, which is ensuring that people have access to clean and safe drinking water. And so making that commitment was the expression of what Canadians would expect any leader to do, which is look at the disastrous infrastructure, undercapitalization of infrastructure in Indigenous communities in some essential services like water provision, and say, I'm going to fix it. And I think a lot of he deserves a lot of credit for saying that. That said, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a number of challenges. First, the commitment has been increased. In 2019, we increased the number of eligible systems because, as a matter of fairness, and as all Canadians would expect, our commitment excluded 250 systems that wouldn't have been eligible under the initial criteria. So we increased the challenge. We also increased the amounts that were dedicated to doing that. But at the same time, we engaged with it. It should never have happened. Some of them, like Neskantaga, have been going on for a quarter of a century. And they said, we want other things, and we want our infrastructures, and we want respect. And this is as much about ensuring critical infrastructure needs as it is about respect. And you asked about the Prime Minister's responsibility. Well, the Prime Minister wrote in my mandate letter that I needed to get it done. And that is where I stand in front of Canadians today and say, we will get clean water to Indigenous communities thanks to this new investment. Noting at the same time that the spring 2021 deadline, there will be roughly a dozen communities for varying reasons that will not be in a position to lift their long-term water advisory. This is a recommitment to them and a commitment to all the communities that have lifted the water advisories, that we will be with them for the long term in ensuring that those advisories that they have lifted they don't have to go into short-term or long-term advisories, and that the people that are turning on their taps get clean water. And that is my responsibility in this, and it's my responsibility to get it done.
Thanks, Christy. Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Alex Bellinghall from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Miller. Just obviously, people have been talking about this issue for a long time, and my understanding is decades. This deadline for March 2021 obviously served for a long time as a real clear accountability benchmark. Now that you're missing it and that now you don't have any deadline, aren't you removing this major prominent accountability measure that was part of this promise? Aren't you making it harder to keep you accountable if this is just sort of an open-ended goal now?
Alex, it's an excellent point, and I hope I can give you an equally excellent answer. It's clear that that goal has certainly focused the minds of a lot of people working day and night to lift advisories. It's also forced us and forced the amazing water teams that are working with communities on a sometimes daily basis to lift their advisories to ensure that there's an urgency to this. I think when you talk to communities, there is no doubt in their minds how urgent this is. As I said earlier, they never wanted these in the first place, and they should have been lifted yesterday. The commitment that we made reflects the feedback that we got from communities, reflects the challenges that we've faced throughout COVID, and dedicates to the long term. I think when you talk to communities about that deadline, at the top of the list for many communities, especially those with long-term water advisories still standing, I look at every single case that remains that remains out there, and these indicate to us that we need to move with urgency. I think from the federal government's perspective, that urgency doesn't change by recognizing the fact that we've got work to do. We continue to hold ourselves accountable, and if Indigenous communities continue to hold us accountable for those dates. I want to be in a position with Indigenous communities and with Canadians to provide an update that says, when is our expected complete date? reflecting the latest information as to what we have. I think you've noticed that the data that we had on our website hasn't been updated since March. The tendency, I think, would have perhaps to blame COVID entirely, and that's not fair. There have been challenges that lie outside COVID, and I want to be clear again about that. What I wanted to be sure was if there was a challenge that was with respect to COVID, that we would allow the time to run to see what exactly that challenge was. There remains about half of the communities that will be beyond the spring 2021 deadline, where you could reasonably say that is accountable to COVID. There are many other factors, and there are probably a number of other communities that are, a couple of which are perhaps in a position to lift their advisories, but are not for other reasons. Some will not be in that position because they have rejected, and rightly so in some situations, interim solutions and are working with us towards longer-term solutions that will take some time. So what I'm hoping, and just to trace the path for everyone who is interested about this, is that by the end of December, we will lift perhaps a maximum of another 20 advisories. Going into spring with a number of other communities that are working really hard to lift their advisories, and be in a position where there's about 12 remaining. And when you talk about accountability, Alex, I hope to be in a position to provide expected completion dates with respect to those particular communities, because we'll really be down to the short strokes, knowing that there's a lot of work to be done. I would also say this, because I think it's an important aspect of your question. If we had taken a cynical approach and said, let's just put all efforts into getting to spring 2021, this wouldn't be a $1.5 billion investment. It would be maybe a couple $100 million investment just to get it done. And that's not right, because communities want us to be there in the long term. So the monies today, especially the ones with respect to operations and maintenance of those plants that are run by sometimes the pride of the community, it's not easy to run a plant. Expect those investments, and in our current policies, the communities were only getting, I believe, 80% and had to come up with the next 20%. So that was a legitimate criticism as to how we deployed our support, our wraparound support for water.
You have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that maintenance formula. Has that changed, or is that changing with this new funding that, the government was funding 80%, I think, and then the First Nation had to have 20%? Is that changing going forward to help maintain the new systems that are coming online?
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll be hammering out the policies, Alex, but my full expectation is that'll move to 100%.
Thanks, Alex. And one more question from the phone before we turn to the room. Operator.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dylan Robertson from Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Minister Miller. You answered my drinking water question, so I have a separate topic to ask about. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister is demanding some clarity from Ottawa around how the vaccines will be prioritized for First Nations. He said he fears a rush of people getting on flights out of Winnipeg and inadvertently infecting people in fly-in reserves. I'm wondering if that's a legitimate concern, and have you reached out to the Premier?
I read that as you did this morning, Dylan. I think it's in my mind, I think it's an important acknowledgement of the vulnerability of Indigenous communities, and I would salute the Premier in his recognition of that. And what we know, particularly as we look at the levels of Indigenous peoples in urban areas, like Winnipeg, where we see a disproportionate number of Indigenous people in ICU, a disproportionate number of Indigenous people that are hospitalized. The absolute priority that must be given to Indigenous peoples when it comes to their safety, their treatment by a first-class medical system that has underserved them historically, as well as the deployment of vaccines. And as we are currently working on the cascade of priorities, clearly Indigenous people need to be at the top of that. And I need all the premiers, and including the territories, to acknowledge that. A number of them have. I think it'll guide our policy as we roll out the vaccine to priority groups, not only in areas where we talk about reserves, where there is a huge federal role, but as we talk about some of the work that needs to be done in urban areas to prioritize the deployment of vaccines. Obviously, the very elderly, essential workers, will be key and as we identify that cascade of priorities. But we need to work with we need to work with provinces to ensure that Indigenous peoples are well served by the medical system, particularly at this point in time, as we will be looking at a staggered deployment of vaccines according to priorities. We have something that we are very proud of in Canada, which is a universal access Medicare system, and a lot of discussion has been had over the last few weeks. And I would direct everyone to the report that Marianne Turpel-Lafont issued with respect to the British Columbia healthcare system, which was scathing in respect of how it has dealt with Indigenous people, that there's a heck of a lot of work to be done. But Canadians consider that our medical system to be one that is based not only on universality, but on fairness. And as we deploy the vaccine, Canadians will recognize that the elderly, essential workers, Indigenous peoples are all people that are very, very vulnerable and have been hit by this, by the COVID vaccine. We need to only look at the numbers of Indigenous peoples touched by COVID in the US to see how that vulnerability exists in Canada as well. So I would welcome the Premier's keen interest in ensuring that Indigenous people stay safe, and I look forward to working with them on ensuring that they continue to stay safe throughout this throughout this pandemic.
Dylan, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. My follow-up is about the community of Ottawa. They were dealing with tuberculosis before COVID-19 hit. The chief is saying that there's not enough support. Your department seems to feel that the existing resources mean that a military deployment isn't needed at this point. I'm wondering if your government's doing enough for Ottawa, and I hate to loop back to the first question, but I'm wondering specifically about the concern about people flying into First Nations reserves to get the vaccine, if you feel that's appropriate, if that's a legitimate concern.
We've struggled throughout this pandemic to ensure that we learned from the lessons of H1N1, Dylan, and that included as communities decided to close down, that we respected their protocols, and part of ensuring that they get proper access to healthcare means sometimes flying in and out, and that can include isolation hubs, that can include sanitary protocols with respect to nurses and workers going in and out of communities. It is an ever-present challenge. I see some of the work that Indigenous Services Canada has done to ensure that those protocols are heightened to make sure that the people that are trying to help, they themselves become vectors of transmission. So yeah, that is absolutely a concern anytime you see more travel that isn't essential. And even with respect to essential travel, it can be a challenge from a sanitary perspective. So any more movement of people is very alarming. When it comes to Shamattawa, we're looking at that from our emergency operations management hub here in Ottawa on a daily, if not hourly basis, to make sure that we respond to the spread in the community, and we stand ready to deploy as necessary anything that is necessary to help the community stay safe. Again, it's an ongoing conversation with the leadership, and I'll be reaching out today to Chief Redhead to speak to him about that.
Thanks, Dylan. I will now take questions from the room. Would you like to go ahead?
I'm Mr. Miller, Mackenzie Gray with CTV News. Then after that, 5 RCMP officers tackled the man. The Ottawa Police Service did an investigation into this and determined that what happened there was lawful. At the time when you were asked about it, you said, quote, "A car door is not a proper police tactic. It's disgraceful, dehumanizing, and a violent act." So my question to you is, how can an act that you've called dehumanizing not lead to charges in this situation?
Mackenzie, I saw what I saw.
Okay. How can Indigenous people trust you on a day where you're backing down from a major commitment about boil water advisories, and they see a situation like this in Nunavut, where if the tables were turned, almost certainly, if an Indigenous man hit a police officer with his car, that man would have been charged and been put in jail. What do you say to people in Indigenous communities in Nunavut and Canadians across the country about perceived injustices in this situation?
Look, every act of racism and expressions of systemic racism are disgraceful. We've seen, I mentioned it earlier about systemic racism in the healthcare system. Indigenous communities, while it was a shock to Canadians across the country earlier on in the year, and these images continue to be a shock, it wasn't a surprise to Indigenous people because they continue to experience it. It's a lived experience for many people that have had negative interactions. And I would stress to say that these are situations where people that are most vulnerable, where their physical integrity is compromised, whether it's at the hands of a police officer that are supposed to protect them, or whether it's at the hands of a healthcare person, whether it's a doctor or a nurse or paramedic. Instances of racism in these situations and systemic racism can kill. And this is a reform that we've undertaken to do. You read it as I did in the throne speech, and we will continue to do it. Continue to hold those who serve and protect Canadians to account, making sure that we reform the RCMP when it comes to our jurisdiction, ensuring that Indigenous communities have police services that are an essential service. And I look forward to working with Minister Blair to ensure that gets done. I will not, I can't exclude that these events will occur again. There's a lot of work to be done in the police service systems in this country, and will continue to do so. You know, anytime you see these events, and I'm someone who does believe in independent reviews of facts, we do need to get to the bottom of these things. But as you mentioned, it further undermines the trust that Indigenous communities in particular find is still quite thin with respect to our police services.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Next question.
Campbell Clark from the Globe and Mail. Mr. Miller, you said the communities don't want an Ottawa imposed deadline and that what they want is a sustainable water systems across the country. But again, systems, when will Indigenous communities in Canada have sustainable water systems like the non-Indigenous communities in Canada that don't break down every year? When will we not see further systems going under long-term boil water advisories for years and years? When will that deadline be met?
Campbell, there are boiled water advisories across Canada. They aren't limited to Indigenous communities. The problem is they occur in a disproportionate incidents in Indigenous communities, and then they go on far too long. So it's the result of undercapitalization in essential infrastructure, namely water infrastructure. It's happened over years. Nescandigo, that's been in the news over the last few weeks, has suffered this for a quarter of a century. People have lived their whole lives without access to clean water. It's totally unacceptable. What the Prime Minister acknowledged during the 2015 election, and we continue to acknowledge it, is that one, this is unacceptable, but it requires sustained investment. Sometimes it involves working with the community to develop a new plant, new distribution system. Sometimes it's an easier fix. When you look at the spectrum of the work that's been done over the last 4 years, you have about 97, close to 100 long-term water advisories that have been lifted, but a lot of the shorter ones that we prevented from becoming long-term water advisories. So very much that deadline, while it was an expression that all Canadians could relate to, because no person should go out without clean water, it was very much one that was informed by that expression of fairness that Canadians expect everyone to be treated equally in this country. Indigenous people aren't treated equally in this country, and it goes from their infrastructure investments to how they're treated by the medical system or the police forces. That deadline was one that we thought was realizable, but it was very much, as I said, dictated by Ottawa. Not every community was canvassed in order to come to that date. But it was also one that while we thought we could realize it, was full of challenges. Even before COVID, we knew winter roads were posing a challenge to getting those. If you don't get it in the year before, it's not going to get built the next year. And so there were challenges. COVID has really changed everything. And in fact, it's focused our mind on making sure that we partner with Indigenous communities for the long term. Many communities have continued to struggle, continue to work every day to lift those water advisories, and we're going to be there every step of the way. The challenge is making sure that we provide the financial backing of the Government of Canada to ensure that they can actually sustain the advanced chemistry and advanced math, doesn't get poached by a neighboring community, or often a non-Indigenous community that'll pay them more, because these people are the pride of the community. That plan is the pride of the community, and we want to make sure that there is sustained investments for them in the long term, as well as the acceleration measures that we know have been caused by COVID, increased infrastructure costs, logistical challenges, making sure there's no transmission of, and that's a reality that I shared with another chief yesterday on the phone. They had to shut things down. So this isn't a manufactured delay that we're blaming on COVID. It's real, and we can document it. It is in the summer of 2021. And frankly, I look at my authorities at Indigenous Services Canada, And that's what I've been working with on my team for the last 6 months. How do I answer that question? How am I going to help you in the summer of 2021 if something breaks down? I mean, we can deploy resources on an emergency measure and cash manage within our budget, but that support and public backing of the government of Canada, now I can guarantee that. And so I think that answers the question.
I'd like to ask you to clarify something that you were saying. It was two related things. One was that in Nescantaga, they may be in a position to lift boil water advisory, but may choose not to do so for other reasons. And then you said at some point that these communities want their water systems to be fixed yesterday, but they have other infrastructure priorities or may have other things that come first. And resolving those things, I think, is difficult for a lot of people. Understanding how a community that wants its water system fixed yesterday also has, a higher priority than clean water, or what those priorities might be. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and it's an excellent question. The communities take a decision, whether it's through a band council resolution after looking at the water results, to lift the long-term water advisory. They may choose not to do so, and that's their prerogative. It is difficult for me sitting here to start talking about the intimate details of decision-making of communities. Some communities are quite public about it, and some I've spoken to Olivia when she went and talked to them. Some are quite private about resolving their challenges. So well, you can ask them. It's difficult for me to speak about a particular community unless they have talked so publicly about it. But the reality is we have been in situations where there may be clean water in the community. The water is testing totally clean. But the community has said, well, there's no guarantee from you, Ottawa, that I can pay my water operator 3 days after I lift the advisory, or the distribution system that may be antiquated, that isn't part, strictly speaking, of lifting the water advisory, i.e. the water going through the distribution system. It may be cracked, there may be leaks, maybe insufficient quantity going into homes. This allows us to deal with water-related infrastructure in and around the lifting of a water advisory. That if I took a very square approach to the conditions necessary to lift that advisory, I wouldn't be able to finance that or support a community that wants a new system. Whereas they would in a position normally be to lift that advisory. Most communities, obviously, it's a matter of great pride to lift that advisory. They don't want to be on an advisory, so they do it. So it's a challenge that we have to compose with. I would say there are very, very few. But my position isn't to speak about the internal dynamics of a community decision. It's to put all the resources necessary to a community to ensure that they are in a position to lift that advisory and that they have clean water, which is the greater effort that needs to be provided as opposed to the symbolic act of lifting a water advisory. While important, the more important thing is ensuring that they have clean water.
Thanks, Campbell. Next question.
Good afternoon, Minister Miller. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. Do you believe your party fully understood the extent of this problem and how to address the challenges with lifting long-term drinking water advisories when your party set this March 2021 deadline? And if not, do you believe you understand how to tackle this issue effectively and efficiently now?
So to your first question, probably not. To your second question, we have a much better appreciation of what is necessary. And this is an indictment of the commitment of the Prime Minister. I think every Canadian expected someone in the leadership position of the Prime Minister to ensure that communities and that everyone in Canada has safe and clean drinking water. I think we didn't appreciate the state of decay of some of the public infrastructure water systems in communities when we came into power in 2015. At that date, Nescantaga would have been at year, I'm doing the math in my head, but at year 20. Lac Seul, that we lifted, and I went there to lift it with the community, would have been in year 12. There was a massive undercapitalization in communities for some time, and there are those sort of extreme examples, but there were many others that were always teetering on the verge. 250 additional systems that were eligible to this categorization with respect to which we were going to lift long-term water advisories. So along the way, as previous ministers did their work and fulfilled their mandate letters, we discovered a number of other challenges, and frankly, we continue to discover challenges with communities as we work with them to lift those water advisories. So, do we have all the solutions right now? No, but we certainly have the financial capacity and the heft to bring it to bear to lift or to remedy a condition with respect to water that is entirely unacceptable in one of the most developed countries in the world. I'd mentioned them. I could get into more detail, but certainly the real and legitimate concerns with respect to O&M was a big question with respect to leadership that we were engaged with in lifting their water advisories. Some ancillary infrastructure demands that wouldn't have fallen, as I mentioned to Campbell, under the strict conditions of our funding for new water systems, as well as other pitfalls along the way, including COVID. So, when the Prime Minister gave me my mandate letter, I sat down with my team and I looked at, and I keep looking at every single water advisory and look at the particular conditions governing that water advisory and say, where can we help? And along the way, we've found some general areas where we can deploy capital. One, the emergency response in infrastructure due to delays caused by COVID, and two, long-term O&M and other supports, the training of community members to make sure those water plants don't fall back into short-term water advisories and then long-term water advisories. So that is a big step forward, and as well as anything else. And when we get down to the short strokes, it'll really be a handful of communities that'll probably need tailored solutions. And I think in respect of one that you interviewed, I believe, in one of your earlier articles, it may be a brand new plant, the community having rejected the interim solution that was proposed to them, which is their prerogative.
When you were explaining the delays, you said that communities, they ran into project delays because of COVID, and the other communities had different priorities that were above having clean drinking water in their communities. That kind of sounds like, with respect, Minister, that you're blaming the communities for missing this target. So I'm wondering how much of the problem would you acknowledge is also the system that's set up with your department to fund these long-term drinking water advisories, to lift them, and how that functions, how that work actually gets done on the ground on time?
No, I'm telling you the facts, Olivia, of candidates to get it done. When I tell you the facts, I can just tell you those are the priorities that have been established. It doesn't mean that people are discounting that, but there, it becomes a case-by-case analysis. At the top of every community's list, pretty much is safe drinking water. But we have to work with communities and their priorities and what they are telling us. And so what I've asked, what I've asked Cabinet for, and they have given, is my team plans to engage with those communities to make sure that they have the resources in order to move towards that process of lifting the long-term water advisory.
Last question from the room.
Hello, Mr. Miller, from the Canadian Press. A legislation to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples seems to be imminent. What such legislation what changes such legislation will bring to your department?
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is an exceedingly important document for Indigenous peoples worldwide. Canada took some time to sign on to it, and when we did not enact legislation. So this is an instrument that is of immense real and symbolic value to Indigenous peoples, and I think to all Canadians. It will do a number of things. It will set a number of principles, and I would encourage people to read it, as to one, what inherent rights Indigenous peoples have, and the federal government's corresponding responsibility, which will be difficult, and I think that's the second part of your question, to implement changes into their laws, into our laws. The first law that comes to mind in my responsibility is the Indian Act. No doubt there will be some real work to continue to be done as we work with communities to get out from under the Indian Act and work towards self-determination. But those principles are a guiding light into what is expected of us as human beings. It's an exceedingly important piece It is not the be-all and end-all. It is a key piece of legislation. We are guided in our principles that exist in Section 35 of the Constitution and the division of powers that exist in Sections 91 and 92. And there will be an immense amount of work after we pass it into law, and it's something I look really forward to doing. I would highlight that one of our MPs' father was one of the contributing members to its. Jaime Batiste, his father was as a Chickasaw from the U.S. was one of the founding authors of, or contributed heavily to the writing of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And as you mentioned that, I can't do that without mentioning the immense contribution of Romeo Saganash in putting that forward as a private member's bill. And when we pass it, I hope it's a great moment of pride for him.
I also want to ask you, there was in the recent economic statement from the government, there was a promise of $200 million for 2 mercury treatment centers on First Nation reserves in Northern Ontario. There was agreements for those mercury centers last year, and there was around 20 million actually for each. What's the extra money for? Is it for an ongoing operation like the?
Excellent question. I think if anyone's followed in any depth the very public challenges with respect to Grassy Narrows and historically an aberration in our history, the contamination of 2 communities, Grassy Narrows and a community called White Dog. This is something that has gone unremedied for 50. Well, it happened in the 1960s, so do the math. It's going on 60 years. The challenge was one that I mentioned with respect to water, which is one of partnership and trust. And while typically in these types of facilities, we would build the hospital, and I would, the hospital in Sioux Lookout is one of the examples. And then we would contribute to working with communities for the ongoing funding and operation. What we found out quite quickly was that there was no trust between Grassy Narrows and the Government of Canada. And in some senses, rightly so. Minister Philpott committed to, and Minister O'Regan, who did some heavy lifting in pushing this forward, committed to building a facility. But what the community wanted that fell outside my authorities was full funding for the contribution of the Canadian government to the health services for treating people that were suffering the effects of mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. So what I could commit to in those agreements that I signed with Grassy Narrows and White Dog early on in the pandemic was to build the mercury treatment centers and to work towards getting funding to secure and assure Grassy Narrows that they had the financial backing of the Government of Canada. Typically in these agreements, we say, we will be there with you, and people say, hey, it's the Government of Canada, we trust them. Well, they didn't trust us. And so part of that trust is putting the money away in a trust to be used for the community to treat their people so that they can live in dignity. That was the demand of Grassy Narrows. And the other community, which I will speak less publicly about it, did not make those demands, but this was about treating them equally as well and giving them the assurance that the Government of Canada was there. This type of long-term care facility is unique in Canada. I hope it'll become a state-of-the-art place where people can study the effects of mercury poisoning. There's only, I think, one other place in Japan that does it. But it is a historical aberration that we are moving to remedy, and frankly, it couldn't happen soon enough. Well, you got to build the building, and then we'll be talking about that's the construction timeline that 18 to 36 months. And then during that time, we'll be working with the communities to work for the specialized care program that the people that are still suffering from mercury poisoning will need, in partnership as well with the services that the Government of Ontario is eager to provide as well. In one case, in the case of Grassy Narrows, there is some resources dedicated to funding a water facility, a new water facility. So that's the other element of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Man. Nous avons le temps pour une dernière question par téléphone.
We have time for one last phone question. Thank you. The last question from Radio Canada. Please go ahead. Good afternoon, Mr. Miller. I have a question, but I'd like to be able to ask two. The first question concerns the deadline, which is no longer one. Why is it that there will no longer be a deadline, whereas 5 years ago you were happy to have a deadline? My second question has to do with Nunavut and the report published. The report says that there was no criminal activity. What is your view of that report? And how do you think Indigenous peoples will react? Answer. I won't speak on behalf of Indigenous people, how they are going to react. I imagine they will have varied reactions, but will be disappointed and not surprised. As I said to your colleague Mackenzie, I saw what I saw. I haven't seen the report yet, however. I will limit my comments to that before saying anything else. I don't know if the report will be made public, but I will look at it. As I said, however, to your colleague Mackenzie, I saw what I saw. As for the deadline that we established, in 2015, it's something to be done. They understood that this situation was inexcusable in Indigenous communities and had lasted more than 25 years in some cases. Morally, it was unacceptable, especially from one of the most developed countries in the world. We provided funding. We wanted to get this done. We wanted to lift long-term drinking water advisories. We contributed some $2.2 billion to this question, in fact. And apart from a few exceptions, we have met our targets, or we were meeting our targets, rather, before COVID-19 arrived. We respected these communities' will to close down their communities to outsiders. The fact that we lost an entire construction season during this pandemic was not a surprise. However, it does create other challenges. What I'm announcing today that is in partnership with the communities, we will examine their long-term needs to build large-scale water and wastewater systems. Sometimes these are sizable challenges. We have funding to invest in these initiatives. As I've told your colleagues, we will continue to work with them, put money into this, into solving this unacceptable situation. Quite reasonably, we're talking about some 12 communities that are facing long-term boil water advisories. We presume rather that our initiatives will work, and that in these cases there may be nuances between the various communities. So I'll say let's wait and look at the spring of 2021 to see what still remains to be done. What I would like to say to Canadians is what the deadlines is. We've heard a lot of communities leadership tell us that they're worried about long-term funding for these plants, these water treatment plants. They require. We had provided more interim measures that weren't enough. That's why today we are announcing this one for ongoing support for daily operations, also to help with any delays caused by COVID-19, and finally to prevent, that is, to prevent drinking water advisories. That is by training operators so that they're not snatched up by the competition. Do you have a follow-up question, Christian? Yes, if I may. Thank you for your long answer with regard to drinking water. I'd like to go back to what happened in Nunavut, as my colleague said, and hit by an Indigenous police officer. Surely things would have been different. What does this do toward about trust in the police service? Answer. I'd say that trust hasn't really been there anyway, or isn't very strong. This situation reinforces this feeling of disappointment in the services that are supposed to be helping them. We need to look at the overall impact on Indigenous people, the impact that continues. Yes, changes need to be made, but they need to be in-depth changes, sea changes that have to do not only with new training for police officers, but also accountability. Increased accountability in these types of situations. What everyone keeps in mind and remembers is that these are not unique and isolated events. Thank you very much. That wraps up our press conference.